we've heard about this modelling figure of around 200,000 Omicron cases a day. And we know that, or we've been told that these cases are doubling, that they're growing exponentially. What do you think about this figure of 200,000? Do you feel that's accurate?
When I first heard it last night, I honestly thought he made a mistake. It seemed utterly absurd. I've had a sleep on it, and over the course of the night, my worry is not that it's absurd, but that it's not absurd. It's based on, it may well be wrong. It's based on some quite pessimistic assumptions, but not ridiculous ones. Our case data, which is what we see on the daily dashboard, is itself lagged by about a week. That normally doesn't matter because not much happens in a week. But in the context of this, the epidemiologists have estimated this is doubling every 2 days, at which point you're talking about 3 doublings between what we can see on our case data and what's happening now. And that's the point where 200,000, which to be clear would be essentially the highest infection numbers we've had in the entire course of the pandemic, alas, doesn't seem too ridiculous. It may not be the case, but my worry is, given it's not absurd, that we're all quite relaxed.
So the question that follows, and Nancy's tweeted this, and I think it's an understandable question for you because in the Mail today there's a GP from South Africa saying Omicron is mild. Everyone's overreacting. It doesn't seem to be doing very much in South Africa. So the question is, Tom, what do we know about the mildness or otherwise of Omicron?
As always at this stage, we have quite conflicting data. Certainly, this in South Africa, it isn't yet filtering through into filling up the hospitals. It looks like the people in hospital are staying there considerably less time and are considerably less serious. There are all sorts of what statisticians call confounding factors to this. It depends on the demographics being infected in the initial wave. It depends on the prior immunity. It doesn't necessarily mean it could be milder simply because everyone's already been infected with Delta. But our modelling is on the assumption it is as intrinsically severe as Delta, which may still result in it apparently being milder. What I would say is that there are very positive signs coming out of South Africa about that. There was also some quite unpleasant noise coming out of Denmark, where it looked like they were getting a case hospitalization rate or infection hospitalization rate of about 1%. So about 1 in 100 people were ending up in hospital, which frankly, with waves the size we're talking about, could be enough to cause real problems.
So, is the point that we don't know how our population would respond in the same way as the South? Is our population? People are saying to us on their messages, South Africa's a lot younger. They've got less vaccination, but maybe more natural immunity. Is that the problem? We can't really read out directly from South Africa.
At this stage in the pandemic, everyone's immunity is different. South Africa's had a beta wave. Beta was an immune escape variant. Perhaps it gives better immunity against Omicron. We don't know. They are different demographics. Yes, they're younger, but they've got more people who are immunocompromised from HIV. But the other problem is we are still early. The biggest numbers won't have translated into hospitalizations and deaths yet from South Africa. So yes, there are positive, very, very positive signs, but it comes amidst a lot of noise and uncertainty.
And Tom, I just want to pick up something you said about immunity. Quite a few people have messaged in saying, what is the situation with natural immunity versus getting your immunity topped up through a vaccine?
Natural immunity seems to be quite good, as you'd expect. There was early data looking at Omicron's reaction to people's blood, found that it was the data that was initially quite scary, found that 2 vaccines, 2 jabs of Pfizer and certainly 2 jabs of AstraZeneca were significantly less good at getting rid of Omicron. But if people were also infected, then that seemed to act a bit like a booster on them. So as you'd expect, infections protect you. But there's something slightly weird on some of the darker corners of the internet where people are saying, why are we ignoring natural immunity? Why are we getting vaccinated when we could have natural immunity? Well, the whole point of vaccination is to avoid the need to get natural immunity, because the process of getting natural immunity involves quite a large number of people dying.
Here's a question which I think we've all asked each other over the last couple of days, and someone sent this in saying, someone in my office said this week, if one person in an office gets Omicron, everyone will get it. Is it really that bad? Most people are double jabbed, but not many have boosters. So that's the question I think we're all fascinated by. If I'm double jabbed, because we'll get to boosters in a moment. If I'm double jabbed and I'm sitting next to Aisha and she's got Omicron, am I almost guaranteed to get it? What's the transmissibility of Omicron among the vaccinated?
Well, among the vaccinated, it doesn't seem, from very, very preliminary data, like being double vaccinated makes a huge amount of difference. Being triple vaccinated, the estimate from Public Health England was about 75% stop protection against infection. And obviously, if you're not infected, you're not going to get it. It does seem to spread a lot better. And, partly that's because it's getting around immunity. As before, it is almost certainly a super spreading virus, which means that most people quite plausibly won't give it to anybody, but some people, partly a function of circumstance and am I still here?
Yeah, you're
Yes.
still here.
Yeah, partly a function of circumstance and partly a function of the biology of the people who have it.
Just to remind us, because I remember this. The sad thing about this is it's taken us back a year. But did we talk about the K rate at one point, Tom? Which was
We did, yes.
The R rate. You got to explain the K rate.
The K rate is this over dispersion number. It's nowhere near as intuitive as the R rate. And it relates to how skewed it is. So most people, it's a bit like income, where we say 20% of people own 80% of the wealth. 20% of people are responsible for 80% of the infections, and that's sort of a measure of how much this is spreading just by everyone sort of slightly infecting household members, and how much this is spreading by people having a good sing-song in church and infecting the entire congregation.
Just on the booster point, then, because Clarissa's asked, how much is our ability to transmit Omicron affected by having the booster? That 70% rate we hear, the 70% efficacy, does that mean if I've been boosted and I come into contact with someone with Omicron, I'm unlikely to contract it at all? Or am I likely to contract it asymptomatically? Or am I likely to contract it but not feel very ill?
So it's 75% against symptomatic infection. You are unlikely to contract it if you have, or you are 75% less likely to contract it symptomatically compared to someone who hasn't been boosted. In terms of whether you're getting it asymptomatically, whether it's not being noticed, it's too early, and indeed that 75% figure is going to be subject to change. It is an astonishing piece of mathematics and epidemiology that they even have that figure this early on. It involves very carefully looking at who's infected, trying to find controls that look similar to them, seeing what happens to them. It is a stunning piece of mathematics, frankly, that UK HSA does every time these turn up, and that most countries simply don't do.
Tom, Deborah asks, we had our boosters as soon as we were offered them on the 1st of November, but we are now worried that they won't last for long and our protection will wane. What is the answer to this?
The evidence from the boosters is that so it's not just about getting your immunity up to the level you had when you were first jabbed with 2. It seems to supercharge the amount of antibodies. Each time you see a pathogen, either through vaccination or infection, your body gets better and better at responding to it. Now, obviously, this is being countered by the fact that the pathogen is changing, but it should have put their antibodies to a far higher level, and it does seem that they then wane less quickly. So I suspect they're probably about as well protected as it's possible for a human being in Britain to be protected at the moment.
There's a certain amount of skepticism, Tom, of people about modelling that comes out. G's asked you can you speak to the accuracy of the modelling of the various variants since the start of COVID? Because we've all known that there's going to be 100,000 cases after schools opened, and 200,000 feels like a very round, large number. I always quote Samuel Johnson that a round number is always wrong. Because there's something so inherently suspicious about that. How confident do you feel that now at this stage of the pandemic, we can model something like 200,000 cases a day?
I think there's been a failure of communication between modelers and the public, and given that I'm the intermediary, that's partly my fault. When I chat to modelers, they are very clear about how little they know and how much these are very basic estimates that essentially give us a set of scenarios to look at. Now, at the beginning, the modelling was, for all of the criticisms, it was pretty good. I mean, basically, it was premised on the idea that the fatality rate was 0.7% and the herd immunity threshold was 60%. And, from that, we got a very good idea that things are going to be very bad. The point where the modelling wasn't great was over the summer. And incidentally, I was chatting to modellers who were saying we really don't know what it's going to do. This is what we've produced, but basically this is entering completely unpredictable time. Now, I would say the modelling is again likely to be reasonably good simply because it's spreading so fast. It's this unstoppable tidal wave. It's when it gets more nuanced, it's when the R is close to 1 that really it's very, very hard to do it. It depends so much on human behaviour because, if you tell people things are going to be bad, then they're not so bad because they're responders. As one modeler said to me, it's like being a weather forecaster, where if you predict that people are carrying umbrellas, then they cease to need them. It's all very confusing. A weather forecaster that can affect the weather is quite an odd situation to be in. So the modelers get a lot of stick. Fundamentally, Neil Ferguson, right at the beginning, predicted that 250,000 people would die if we continued our policies as they were at the beginning of March. We've since had the most major public health intervention in the history of the UK, and we're up to 170,000. So, I think maybe he was a bit optimistic.
And we've had a lot of people getting in touch about how deaths are counted, Tom. Many people are pointing out the phrase people died with Omicron rather than from. People are wondering what that means and whether it means deaths attributed to the virus could be lower than reported. I think this is COVID in general, not just Omicron.
Yeah. So there's several ways of measuring deaths. The roughest and readiest is deaths within 28 days of a positive test. Now, as was pointed out right at the beginning of the pandemic, this means that if I get COVID and I get run over by a bus, I am a COVID death, according to that statistic. We then have these statistics. Those statistics are produced because we need instant figures. There are then later statistics that are produced, which are based on whether COVID is put on the death certificate, which implies it's a contributing factor. It's almost always going to be a contributing factor because you don't die just of COVID, you die of being old and having COVID, you die of being obese and having COVID, you die of having an underlying condition and having COVID. Those figures with it on the death certificate are currently about 40,000 higher than the statistics with 28 days because some people die after 28 days. So it seems like there's this idea, yes, it could be with COVID or of COVID, but it actually feels like of COVID is actually higher than with COVID.
That's interesting. Pippa says, nearly 2 years into the pandemic, we're experiencing another wave with higher transmission, but weaker potentially in its effects. Is this what happens in pandemics? And I suppose, answer that question, Tom, then I've got a follow-up after that. But go on, answer that. Are we seeing a standard model of what happens in pandemics here?
There's this idea, and I'll explain it briefly. There's this idea that evolutionarily, when I've written about this, a virus doesn't want to kill you. It wants you to be going about, walking about, doing your business, spreading it to other people. It has absolutely zero interest in your death because if you die, you can't spread it. So under this idea, if the virus can evolve to be weaker so that it doesn't kill you, that version of the virus will have an evolutionary advantage and will prevail. The problem with that in the context of COVID is COVID doesn't actually care whether you're alive or dead. By the time you die of COVID, you're almost certainly not spreading it anyway. There's very little evolutionary pressure on it to get weaker. There's a lot of evolutionary pressure on it to get faster, and that's what we've seen has happened, and to evade immunity, and that's what we've seen has happened. When Alpha and Delta turned up, they were probably a little bit more virulent. Basically, every viral evolutionary scientist I've spoken to has said that, it may get weaker, it may get stronger. It basically doesn't care. And you could well, if we're in sort of COD evolution, you could well imagine a situation where it makes you make more viral particles so that it spreads faster. As a consequence of that, it might make you sicker and more people will die, but it'll still gain far more advantage from the fact it can spread faster than from the theoretical idea that someone who's died is no longer spreading it, because after a month, it doesn't care.
I get that. And just finally, it may be 200,000 cases a day. It may be doubling very quickly. We are going to have this massive booster campaign, which may reduce the effectiveness of the virus to infect us. Where do you stand as of the 14th of December, Tom, in terms of optimism about what's going to happen in the next few weeks?
I think the absolutely the key thing is whether to see what happens and whether this 200,000 prediction is correct. And if it is, then, and to be clear, that's not really the modelling. And in fact, that's more than the modelling predicted. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine didn't have anything like as high. That is essentially the UK Health Security Agency drawing a line on a logarithmic scale. And that's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. But if that comes through, we should know by next Monday. We should start seeing in the case figures 120,000 cases, which will be absolutely massive. And then the key thing is what happens to people ending up in hospitals. Am I optimistic? I'm a lot less optimistic than I was yesterday. And I'm getting awful March 2020 vibes, but I may just need more sleep.